we have kind of a caricature of what a survivor of sexual abuse looks like. It's like a woman, and a lot of times they're self-blamed for it and how it's depicted in the media. Like they did something, they wore an outfit that led it to happen. And it's all these rape myths that we have put out into the world. And then when it happens to a man, or when a man thinks about it, it doesn't fit that mold so much. So then they have to kind of reconcile that. And that often can lead them to think negatively about themselves. So common things that we see in research and that I've observed in my own practice is that men are going to be more likely to endorse beliefs about being weak, or about not being strong, or about being dirty, or not biting hard enough.
Welcome to Just Healing,
where we say the quiet stuff out loud.
I'm Dr. Deborah.
I'm Michael Munson.
Join us to laugh, cry, cringe, heal.
Not necessarily in that order. Welcome to Just Healing, a podcast of men healing. I'm Michael Munson, one of your podcast co-hosts. I'm happy to be here today with Evan Basting. Evan is somebody who loves data and research, probably as much as I do, probably more than I do, which is how our paths crossed a few years ago. So I'm excited to kind of nerd out and use that in an affirming way to nerd out with you today, Evan, and look at the importance of data and trauma and healing.
Yeah, definitely. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you today. It's nice to meet up and chat about data. It's always a joy of mine. Who I am. So I'm a clinical psychology doctoral student at the University of Tennessee. I'll give a little background too on where I got and how I got to where I'm at. So I grew up in rural Ohio, actually, and I wasn't at all exposed to psychology or data or anything about this stuff. I knew that I wanted to get out of rural Ohio. That was my main goal when I was younger. So I went to Cleveland, Ohio, which was like the big city for me. And that was where I wanted to go study for my undergraduate studies. And when I was there, I got exposed to my first psychology course. And I just absolutely loved psychology. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for my career, but I loved psychology. And what really attracted me to it was all the research studies that they tell you about in that Psych 101 class. And I love the science of psychology and the ability to get involved in research studies as an undergraduate. And the question that kind of got me, the one that really started to make me think about going into clinical psychology, was when I started to do a research project where we looked at the cycle of violence. And what the cycle of violence is, or they sometimes call it the intergenerational transmission of violence, is this idea that people who experience violence in their childhood, whether it be that they're witnessing it or they're actually being abused, they're more likely to be in relationships where they experience violence, whether they perpetrate it themselves or experience it themselves. And I was just so mind blown by that concept. And I wanted to continue to study that and understand what are some of the reasons why that cycle happens in the first place. Why do people select partners or have partners who abuse them later? Or why do these sort of patterns get reenacted? And what are some factors that are risk or resilience pathways that can prevent that in the future? So that's what drew me to where I'm at now at the University of Tennessee. I work in a research lab where we look at intimate partner violence and substance use. And my focus has really been looking at how does trauma influence people's behavior in relationships, and also health risk behavior that can also increase risk for violence in relationships. So I see a lot of benefits to doing research on that to inform prevention and intervention efforts for clinical psychologists. And then my other professional hat is I'm recently a part of Men Healing as well. I've been doing some of the data on the program evaluation project that's going on, looking at the effectiveness of some of the programming that's being done for survivors, male survivors of sexual harm, and also their partners and community groups and all of that, and looking at how the efficacy of that. And another side project is that apparently there's been a lot of great work in implementing a ebook course in the prisons across the country that's teaching incarcerated people about trauma and providing psychoeducation. And we know that a lot of times there's not a lot of resources for that population. So I've been looking at some of the data from that as well and helping put that together to disseminate, which has been really great.
Cool. And obviously you have many more hats, which is really fantastic, but we are so happy at Men Healing to have you as part of our extended team right now, as well as to draw on all of your experiences and the other work that you've done. Do you have any personal tidbit you'd like to share? Like, what do you like to do for fun? Anything that's exciting that you'd like to offer?
Of course, yeah. I've really gotten into yoga. I've been doing that for several years now. And one thing that I've learned as being someone who's into yoga is that I'm not good at it. And the big lesson that comes from that is you can be bad at things and still let it be your hobby. And that it has been a practice in humility and mindfulness, but also just good for my overall well-being. So that's something that I really value. And I really try to integrate the aspects of that throughout my life, because I think doing really heavy work where we're I'm a therapist as well, so a lot of that work involves
Sure.
working with survivors of trauma and hearing a lot of stories. And a big part of being able to show up as a researcher and a clinician addressing very heavy topics is having self-care and being able to take care of myself and integrating balance in my life. So that's something that I really try to make the through line of my existence, is to have balance and practice care.
That's a perfect example too, because I mean, what we're going to talk about today might feel like remote, it might feel clinical, it might feel whatever, but like there's a human part of it. There's like this balance of like, what do we look at? Things are really serious, but things can be resilient. I mean, we can look at all of these components, which is really what's fascinating. So like our personal lives as well as what we do for our work. So thank you.
Yeah.
And good on yoga. So that's cool.
Try my best.
I just started weightlifting again. It's like, awkward feeling. Okay. It's doing it. That's important. So
Exactly.
excellent.
It's all about the process at the end of the day.
It is. It totally is. So you've shared a little bit about what your research has focused on. Do you want to go into a little bit more detail about some of those threads? I know about them, but let's share them with other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. So overall, the most broad way to describe it is I'm looking at how trauma impacts behavior in relationships and also health risk behavior, as I kind of said. But I've also focused specifically on sexual and gender minority people, and we've collaborated on projects where we've looked at that as well. And what I'm really interested in is understanding, in addition to that cycle of violence, how do the unique stressors that this population faces impact this relationship, and how does that intersect with rates of trauma exposure? We know a lot of data shows that sexual and gender minority folks have higher rates of trauma, and specific sub-identities within that umbrella experience even higher rates due to their identities. So that's a big thing that I'm interested in, because we also see that that's reflected in health disparities. There are higher rates of substance use a lot of times, intimate partner violence sometimes in this population. And a lot of the research points to those factors that need to be studied and understanding what's happening. So that's something that I'm really interested in, is focusing on that population and looking at unique risk factors. I've also worked with folks that are in treatment for substance use disorders. That's been a big part of my research too, looking at archival data and data that's reflected on, like, what are they saying when they first show in? What are their symptoms? How can we use that to inform programming in the treatment center that I work at? Also work with college students and looking at unique risk factors among that population. Looked at adverse childhood experiences, particularly among people that have substance use disorders, and thinking about how do certain types of adverse childhood experiences create risk for certain outcomes. For example, do some people that have a lot of experiences with household dysfunction versus some people who just experience a lot of abuse, do they have different outcomes in terms of like their sexual risk behavior later in life, or their PTSD symptoms, or what have you, particularly among folks in substance use treatment, to inform interventions. I've looked at a lot of different comorbidities among people that have substance use disorders, like compulsive sexual behavior and risk factors. So that's a broad overview, but I've tried to look at a lot of different types of populations that intersects with the topics of trauma, substance use, health risk behavior.
Great. Cool. And I realize when you say sexual and gender minorities, a lot of folks that are not academic are like,
yes,
what the heck is that? Do you want to give a little shorthand version of what common everyday folks might think of when they hear that?
Yes. So in the real world, we might say LGBTQ plus folks. So anybody who falls with that umbrella. And also I realize I use jargony term like compulsive sexual behavior, which is just another way, but I think more colloquially people will say like sex addiction or, hypersexuality, those kind of behaviors where it's causing problems. People have a lot of sexual urges and behaviors that can lead to problems. So yeah, academic jargon comes out really fast with us.
It's all right. And it's all good. It's like we all have different ways that we talk about things. And sometimes we have our lives that are split that, in the daytime I talk about it this way and at nighttime I talk about it this way. So thanks for the consolidation of those things.
Of course.
One of the things that struck me when you were talking about intergenerational trauma and ACEs, two separate things, but very related things. I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit about kind of how those two things relate, what it means, what you found so far in looking at those two separate areas.
Absolutely. So the ACEs, for those that don't know, the ACEs, it's like a commonly used questionnaire in both the medical field and the mental health field, because there's been this research that shows that people can experience a lot of different types of negative experiences before the age of 18. And it shows sort of this dose-response relationship, meaning that as you accumulate more negative experiences, your risk for health outcomes later in life can be a lot worse. Negative health outcomes can be worse as you have more of these adverse experiences. So these ACEs span across experiencing abuse, witnessing abuse, having family members who have mental health problems, having family members who are incarcerated. They've been expanded to look at more systemic factors like community violence and being low SES, and how those can also be traumatic experiences that can increase risk for health problems later in life. So that's a big thing that's been studied a lot in psychology and understanding like how do these relate to mental health outcomes and other long-term outcomes that are related to mental health problems as well. And that can intersect, like you said, with intergenerational transmission of violence, because we
Yeah.
see that it's also assessing those different it's different subtypes of abuse. So it's not just saying were you abused, it's looking at were you emotionally abused? Were you
Right.
physically abused? Were you sexually abused? And then we can look at those specific ACEs to predict outcomes later to see like, does sexual abuse predict this, or does physical abuse predict this, or do both, or does one predict one over the other? And that can help understand some of those intergenerational pathways is by looking at, you get sort of a yes or no to each one of these, and you can see which one of these predicts the outcome over the other. So it just helps to kind of disentangle instead of, because we know that sometimes these co-occur, sometimes people just experience one, and it could just be helpful to have this checklist.
I was thinking about our talk today, and I was thinking about what's going on in the world right now, which is a lot of stuff with ICE, a lot of stuff in Minnesota, and people getting killed and harmed, and the process of people witnessing that. So like what happens to our ACEs kind of framework when people are young and they're witnessing either on TV or in person some of those things, and how does that then affect? So that was kind of a more rhetorical question, but it's to me it's kind of another example of expanding ACEs a little bit to how do we witness things that are around us, not just within our home. So if you want to share anything about your thoughts on that, I'd love it. But
yeah, that's a great point. And I think we see this trauma like you're describing in society, and a lot of people that are in the mental health field don't know that you can develop PTSD from just observing something in your environment. It doesn't have to happen to you necessarily. And specifically we see a lot of racial trauma coming up around us, even if more recently we've been seeing white folks being brutalized and murdered by ICE agents. This still has a lot of ramifications for people of color who have been brutalized for decades, it's centuries, honestly. So there is a lot of that re-traumatization just from seeing footage of this stuff happening and witnessing police brutality that we're seeing is impacting people of color in particular, because this has been happening for so long. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense from the ACE standpoint too, is to think about what are you observing in your childhood and how does that kind of re-erupt with these new things that you're experiencing later in life and bring up old memories.
And thank you. You brought in kind of intersectionality, which is, maybe where we can go next when you give us a little bit of an overview of data. But that those intersectional pieces really play a role in how people develop and what their resilience and risk factors might be. But I took us off course. So let's scroll back a little bit. And do you want to give us kind of a big picture overview, data overview of trauma, wherever you'd like to go with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So with trauma, a lot of the work that I have done, I'm both a clinician and a researcher, so I like to have both inform each other. I work at a residential substance use treatment center as a trauma-focused therapist primarily. So I've noticed that there's a lot of overlap between the clinical work I'm doing and the research, and it's kind of like a common phrase as clinical psychologists is that we're supposed to be scientist practitioners, meaning that our research is supposed to inform the work we do, and the work we do is supposed to inform our research. But one thing that's been really cool that I've observed in this experience working with folks, particularly sexual, or I guess we'll say LGBTQ plus folks in this environment, is the way that internalized stigma, which is this belief that people have negative beliefs about being a sexual and gender minority person, and how that may influence or intersect with their trauma. And that's been something that's been a research focus of mine, but it hasn't actually been actualized until I've started doing some clinical work and I've seen it actually show up. When we do trauma work, a lot of times we're looking at the beliefs that people have about their traumatic experience and how they've sort of made meaning about it. And a lot of times people, or I guess every time that people develop PTSD, they have really unhelpful beliefs about it. And it can often manifest in like self-blame about the circumstances. And a really unique way that I've noticed for queer people in particular and how they conceptualize, especially here in rural Appalachia where I reside, is that they internalize it as a sort of like what they experience is because they're queer. Like they deserve it in a way because they've been told by society, by their parents, by their faith communities that they were raised in, that bad things are going to happen to queer people. And we see in history that bad things have happened to queer people, which is often structural, but it's easy to internalize that as something about them. So they may think that they deserve what happened to them because they're queer, or that it's almost like a punishment in a way. So that's been really informative, I think, for doing more research on minority folks, people that come from more minoritized backgrounds, is to think about how does stigma intersect with those trauma appraisals, and how can that be a way to also treat trauma. So that's a big part of my research focus and my clinical focus.
Could you give folks some examples of other types of stigmatized populations? I mean, it might seem like an obvious thing, but sometimes it's not obvious.
Yeah.
Who else might be stigmatized in our part of the world?
Of course, yeah. We think of racial minority folks, so people who are people of color, and also the intersections of the two. So people who are trans people of color, they may have unique stressors. Getting at that intersectionality piece is that there's so much negative messaging that people experience related to their identities, but they don't meet the mold of being a white, heterosexual, cisgender man, ultimately. Any deviation from that comes with some marginalization that can be internalized. People may, if they're a woman, they may internalize different beliefs about women and because of what they're told a woman should be like. And then when they're treated or when they act in a way that's not like that, they can feel shame about that. And that kind of goes for racial minority folks as well, people of color. If they are told that they're going to fail all the time in educational systems, and then they start to not do very well in education, like everybody doesn't do well, that can have bigger ramifications because it's already been instilled in them that they're not going to do well, and that could cause a downward spiral. So we see this occurring a lot with folks that have these different backgrounds, is that it can put them at greater risk for having those beliefs that society teaches them activated.
Yeah. That's really great. Thank you for explaining that a little bit deeper. Why don't we look at some of the areas that you focus on? Why don't we look at substance use and go a little bit deeper, either with data that you'd like to share or some of the kind of the trends or the things that you're seeing that relate to substance use and trauma, specifically male survivors of sexual.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll give a background on like the theory of trauma and substance use. I think that helps to understand a little more. It's probably pretty colloquial. A lot of times think about self-medicating, but that's what it's called in academic spaces with substance use and trauma, is that a lot of times people use substances, particularly like alcohol use is a big one. Things that can calm the body are often what's used when it comes to trauma, because trauma symptoms look a lot like a lot of physiological arousal, a lot of disturbing memories that come up and thoughts that come up and images, and all of that can erupt. And substance use can be a really powerful, understandable coping response for all of that, particularly for folks who don't have resources to seek mental health care. So that often substance use is very conducive and very reinforcing for people to use when these different things are coming up to cope with this distress. And then it only starts to make people want to be more likely to do it, because once you're not using, you ultimately come down. And then all that stuff comes right back. And then people are like, okay, I know it worked before, so I'm going to do it again. But as that pattern sort of continues, you start to need more substances for it to kind of do the effect that you intend it to do. And then it can create a need for other substance use when one isn't working as well as it needs to be, or putting things together. And that's how we get into this really sticky sort of cycle of addiction that leads to substance use disorder development from PTSD. So that's the broad overview. And when we think about particularly male survivors of sexual abuse, there's just, I think that pattern goes across gender. Like we see, that doesn't really matter necessarily gender for that pattern to happen, but there can be unique pathways for men in particular when they survive sexual abuse, because again, going back to societal messaging, we have kind of a caricature of what a survivor of sexual abuse looks like. It's like a woman, and a lot of times they're self-blamed for it and how it's depicted in the media. Like they did something, they wore an outfit that led it to happen. And it's all these rape myths that we have put out into the world. And then when it happens to a man, or when a man thinks about it, it doesn't fit that mold so much. So then they have to kind of reconcile that. And that often can lead them to, again, as I talked about, think negatively about themselves. So common things that we see in research and that I've observed in my own practice is that men are going to be more likely to endorse beliefs about being weak, or about not being strong, or about being dirty, or not fighting hard enough. And all of those sort of things come up because there is so much tied to masculinity and being strong and and especially being able to resist these sort of things. Like there's an expectation that should be strong enough, even if they are children when they experience it. I notice that's even sometimes harder when it's a male perpetrator as well, because then they start to question their sexual orientation, which that can be linked to not feeling like they're masculine enough. And there's just a lot of more gendered things that happen inside at the individual level with men that can lead them to be in a unique risk pathway for PTSD. And that, of course, then once they have those kind of developments, and they're going to use substance use to maybe feel stronger or to feel more empowered and to kind of conquer these different things. So it really can be it happens across traumas, but there's really unique ways that we can look at the individual level with sexual trauma and how it happens. And that ultimately can inform how we treat it.
Yeah, that makes sense. With sexual trauma, I'm always cautious to talk about gender, but does research show differences between male survivors of sexual trauma or sexual harm versus women versus trans people? Like, are there differences in use, age of starts, what substances people are using versus not using? Are there any patterns that have emerged that are consistent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know a lot of the patterns off the top of my head, but I do know that women are going to be more likely to say that they've experienced sexual abuse, but we don't know for sure that that is the case a lot of times. And with trans and non-binary folks, a lot of times we're going to see higher rates of sexual abuse too. And sexual minority folks as well, there's higher rates of endorsement. And a lot of times there's a myth that goes around and that's often internalized that causes people to be queer in some way. And there's no data to prove that at all, but we do see that there are either higher rates of them being more open to reporting it, and that's why we see higher rates, or it's just that they may be victimized earlier because there's like gender nonconformity that's occurring that leads people to want to enact these different behaviors towards them. So there's just a lot of explanations, but I think it's really easy for the brain to sort of look at a causal chain and know that that's not necessarily the case. And with gender, like a lot of times with perpetrators, a lot of the perpetrators are men. We see that more often than not, but there are female perpetrators as well, both for young women and also young men. But it's more complicated. It's hard to know how much of it is of these disparities is based on a willingness to share versus what's actually happening out in the world. So it can be tricky.
And does substance use change within gender or within age?
I guess I feel like a lot of it peaks around young adulthood is what we see with substance use. That's when people start to try and really use a lot. But when it comes to substance use disorder, it can be a lifelong thing. I don't know exactly the rates of where it gets the highest, but the initiation and the part of, on average, heaviest use is in young adulthood with age. And then gender, I feel like a lot of times we've seen men overrepresented in treatment, and it's often been thought of as like a man's problem, substance use disorders. But more and more, as treatment has changed and as approaches have changed, we've seen a lot more representation of women in substance use treatment as well, and with substance use disorders. But if I recall correctly, I think the rates still show that they're higher for men at this point for substance use disorders, and there might be deviations across different types of drugs of choice. I know that like with methamphetamine and certain drugs, like they're higher in sexual and gender minority populations, and we see different changes across subpopulations, but I'm not 100% sure which ones across gender.
Yeah, and some of that is about how culture and subcultures reinforce those behaviors with, who's doing what, who are the cool kids, let's be like the cool kids, whether that's in big quotes. But so I know that affects things, not just what does the chemical do and how does it make me feel and how does that help with trauma. So lots of complicated ways of how that plays.
Yes, definitely. So many different ways we can look at different identity characteristics and how they create unique risk.
Yeah. Why don't we switch? Why don't we change subject a little bit? And this is related, I think to substance use in a lot of ways, but when we look at relationships and how people engage with each other, whether it's intimate relationships or other kind of close relationships, what is data showing us? What is research showing us about how those relationships develop, how they are healthy, not healthy in big air quotes again, based on somebody's prior victimization history or harm, based on anything else?
Yeah, I think we can look at both the negative and the positive sides to how relationships can operate and be influenced by these experiences. I think there's going to be a lot of negatives that come from it for folks who don't seek treatment, who have not been able to have help for what's happening. We might see more sexual problems in relationships. There may be more difficulties with trust in relationships in general for both sexual things, but also outside of that for survivors of sexual harm. And just intimacy can be really challenging because a lot of times, as I mentioned with PTSD, it's all about beliefs. So people may believe that getting close to someone is dangerous because it was taught to them at an early age that someone got close to me and they hurt me, so it's likely that I'm going to get hurt again. So that can be a really big barrier in getting close, is that people will keep people at a distance because they don't want to be hurt. And that can really be hard for relationships to get through without having some serious help with that. Then there's more casual, so that's thinking more about intimate relationships, but also we see higher rates of, as I mentioned, hypersexuality sometimes among survivors of sexual abuse as a way to reclaim that sexual behavior, the way that they had their agency taken away from them when they were younger, and try to create positive experiences with sex as well, and to cope with the stress around the overall experience of having PTSD or having traumatic stress related to what's happened to them. And that can be a really strong way of coping that can also lead to a lot of problems and health risk behavior associated with that. And then in the sort of IPV context, we see that PTSD can kind of influence as one likelihood to perpetrate violence. Because again, if they feel like their partner betrayed them or they can't trust their partner, it might activate anger in a way that may not show up for someone that doesn't have PTSD, because there is just so much more emotional valence to that, or strength to that as well. And if they're drinking alcohol to cope with their PTSD, then that's even more of a perfect storm, because then they're experiencing more anger, they're drinking, which makes them more likely to perpetrate violence because they're so focused on that aggression and less uninhibited, as that they can perpetrate it more. So that can be a lot of the way that can influence the way that people handle conflict in relationships. And then on the flip side, victimization, we see a lot of re-victimization sometimes with folks who survive abuse. And that's at all always to blame the perpetrator for that. But there can be ways that victims sometimes replay and reenact experiences in relationships that are familiar to them if they were abused in close relationships before. And may have beliefs about what relationships should look like. And that can create a pretty vicious cycle as well. And also partners may be less empathetic towards their sexual concerns or fears around sex, and maybe more likely to coerce or perpetrate because they're like, why are you not able to do this? And not really understanding. So that's a lot of the negatives, but I think that relationships can also be a source of healing for people who experience interpersonal trauma, is that by having a model of a good relationship, it can also be really corrective. It can provide an example to a survivor that having a healthy relationship is possible, and that there can be trust, and they can get through some of these beliefs by being able to practice with someone who's safe and consistent. So really a way to support survivors is to help them build close relationships so that they can have new experiences beyond the traumatic experiences that they're so used to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. As I've been listening to you, I've been, I have a different perspective because I have research background as well, but I'm listening to you and going like, well, but how does data affect actual survivors? So what I'm hearing you say is do people think that, research is just kind of affirming or denying what not we all know, but what we're seeing in practice? How does research help survivors in kind of in the moment, or in the moment in the future? How does it play out from data to?
Yeah, to your point, it does in a way legitimize the things that we often observe. A lot of times research findings aren't that surprising. We've seen it in the world. We understand it at a basic level, but it really can help validate what we already believe about certain things. And then that can be used in a lot of different ways. So in the clinical psychology world, we're often focused on the individual. So we try to use our research to improve the way that we do interventions. So if we can have certain findings that show that for example, one thing that I think of is the comorbidity between substance use and PTSD. There's been research that's done intervention work that's shown that as long as you treat one of them, a lot of times the other will reduce with it. And that would not be done without having research to support that happening. So it can really inform the way that interventions are tailored and approaches that are ultimately done in the real world, and how practitioners work with populations. It also has implications on a more structural level. There's researchers that do more advocacy work or work in public health that can help tell academics what's happening in the real world when they're disconnected. And then academics can use that to translate to policy and ultimately have things that are, and a lot of times policies are based on the data that we share, that researchers share. Hopefully that would be in an ideal world. May not be as legitimate today, but that is what we aspire, is that policy is informed on research that is well and rigorous and well validated. Yeah. And then another way that it can directly help survivors is I think it can validate the experiences when working with people, is by presenting data to them as well. I think a lot of times we hear, especially with male survivors, is that they think that they feel shame around the experience, and they think that their experience is so unique and that no one can understand that. And I think a really powerful thing that we do in PTSD treatment is start off with psychoeducation and talk about what does data show about people. And this treatment works. We have data to support that this works for someone who has problems like you. You're not so special in the most compassionate way possible. Yes, it's horrible what happened to you. And other people have experienced that too and have had good outcomes by doing this hard work. And that means that you probably can too. And just being able to normalize and validate their experiences and empower them and give hope, that can be a really powerful use of data as well, beyond just using it outside of the individual level.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think sometimes people think about data as something that's so remote, and how does that affect my life? As a survivor, I don't see the data, I don't know the data. But I mean, what you're saying too is if clinicians or folks that work with trauma survivors know some of that data, it can be really validating to the survivor. And it can also then, kind of inform how that treatment, which is a clinical term, but how how healing might be able to unfold and happen with somebody.
Exactly.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said, and I'm not sure the language that you used, but it reminded me of how important sometimes it is to have kind of community partners and academic partners so that both sides are kind of getting it right, like the right questions are getting asked, and that it's not researchers kind of operating in a vacuum or community members not operating, so like, how do those populations work together? I've at least seen better research coming out of those kind of shared models.
Great.
Has that been your experience, or am I just, from my perspective, seeing that as a perk?
No, I completely agree with you. I think to the point that we started at the very early part of this discussion is that academics use a lot of jargon. We're kind of in a bubble in our ivory tower, and sometimes it can get to a point that we are so disconnected from the people that we're actually trying to help that we're missing the mark completely. So there is so much value in being grounded and actually, one, having conversations with the people that we're working with, but yeah, also having conversations with the people who are working with the people directly as well, the organizations, and getting their insight. Because if we're using academic jargon and using those terms for our measures and then throwing that at participants, if participants don't know what that's meaning, then we're not capturing the thing that we think we need to be capturing. Or if we're potentially committing racism or microaggressions in certain types of ways with the way that we're phrasing things, and we're not getting that feedback directly from our participants because we're just doing, like, we're giving them a survey and then we're taking the data, then we're in a way enacting harm on the population that we're trying to help. And having a community organization or outside folks work with researchers to advocate for that community, or even working directly with that community, can help improve reduce the likelihood that we're going to be doing harm to our community as we start to research and the people that we research.
Thank you. That was kind of a self-serving question that I just asked, but not really, but it reminds us all that, we need to work together to get to the same kind of ultimate goal of, like, how do we reduce violence? How do we stop violence from happening? How can people heal and recover and become more full and whole in their process of healing? So
absolutely.
Thank you for indulging me with that.
Happy to.
I'm wondering, do you have anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up today?
No, this has been a really great discussion. It's just been really nice to be able to walk through the different ways and for me to even think about, why do I do what I do? And I think a lot of times you don't have to be a researcher to appreciate, I think, just how important it can be and how important it can, and how these can have really great implications for the people that we're working with, and how we can try to integrate research in the work that we're doing, in the programming that we're doing. So I appreciate, that's like one of the best parts of my career, is being able to work directly with these folks, but also be able to advocate for them in other ways. So I love the opportunity to talk about it anytime I can.
I love the opportunity to talk about data and stuff too. So yay. Thank you. So Evan, thank you for being here today and taking your time. I know that you're in a really busy time of your life, so being here really means a lot to me, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be really excited to be part of this conversation as well. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more, get involved, or find community, visit menhealing.org.